Good evening. I do want to say before we start, our plan, the song leaders are going to meet Sunday afternoon and we'll sort through your songs you picked out. My plan was for us to do that last Sunday, but we didn't really get to do that because we weren't here. So the songs that you have picked out, the ones that you've wanted, they won't start this week, but it'll start January 8th instead. So these are every song on Sunday are Ben's choices, so you can fuss at Ben. Don't fuss at anybody else on that. That's not true. I texted you today and said throw one of them's my choice. So, but anyway, we were unable to be together on Sunday, and so that was sort of what ended up happening with that. Today we are going to talk about mercy. We are going to cover this. It might be maybe a little bit different. There's not a ton of scripture reading for us, what we're going to focus on. But we are going to talk about a story that comes from the book of Genesis. And so if you would, you can go ahead and be turning to Genesis chapter 45. We're going to be talking about Joseph. And my game plan was I know what I wanted to do. We'll put it that way. But then when you start looking at it, the story of Joseph in Genesis covers like 20 chapters. And I just wasn't sure if we was ready for 20 chapters or not. So I'm going to presume some knowledge tonight. I'll try and throw a few things at you as reminders, but I really only want to focus on sort of one particular thing within the Joseph story. So you might want to go to Genesis and just read the whole thing here in the next day or two and fill in any blanks that you might have had right there. Here in the last little bit, Will and I have played mercy with each other a little bit. Some of y'all may remember this. Some of you may have called it uncle at a different time, but you took each other's hands and you tried to twist them and get the other one to stop. We used to do that all the time growing up. I used to do that to Jess. She was not as fond of it as I was. She didn't like that as well. But Will is pretty terrible at it, just to be honest with you. He kind of twists you there, and you say stuff to him like, when are you gonna start? When does this begin? But we know that when we're playing that, when we're playing that game, you get to a point when somebody yells out mercy, that's when you're supposed to stop. But we ask for mercy in that situation. We can't really sort of handle it anymore. Keep that in mind tonight as we go through it. There's any number of examples that we could look at in the Bible, mercy in the Old Testament. Genesis 43 and 14, and may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved. We'll see that. That's kind of where our story is going to be here in a few moments. A few others, though. Exodus 33:19, then he said, I will make all of my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. Psalm 51, verses 1 and 2. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. Finally, there at the end, Micah 7 and 18. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in mercy. I would hope that would be a descriptor of us. I think, unfortunately, some of us delight in the opposite of mercy sometimes. Anyway, we can almost grind down a person even more. We sometimes do. I think about, you don't see as many people smoking today as you used to, but I think about when you see people throw a cigarette down and then they take the tip of their toe and they would just grind it down as hard as they could. And I think sometimes we like to do that with people that sometimes deserve mercy, because we like to throw them into the ground and then just bury that even further sometimes. But that's not the way God is described. In the New Testament, Matthew 9 and verse 13, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Ephesians 2 verses 4 and 5, so what Pat read there just a moment ago. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. Two more there at the end. Hebrews 4:16, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. I suspect a verse that most of us are quite familiar with. And finally, Jude 1 and verse 23, the only verse 23 in Jude. them out of the fire, hating even the example of showing mercy as well. About here this evening is this notion of mercy, and more specifically, the story of Joseph. Okay, and so we're going to talk about Joseph here today. And in our lesson tonight, Joseph had a choice. He could choose to punish his brothers for what they had done to him, or he could forgive them and reunite with them. Joseph chose forgiveness, mercy, and God wants us to forgive others too. And so I want us to think tonight a little bit about how mercy is in reality a choice. Mercy is not just a naturally occurring thing within us, but mercy is a choice. Because when Will and I were playing that game with our hands there, twisting them, if he yells mercy, I have two options, right? I can either continue to make that hand hurt or I can stop. And so our idea of mercy is a choice. And Joseph has a choice here tonight. I got a couple of things I want you to think about beforehand. I want you to think about a time that someone wronged you and you got angry about it. You don't have to say it out loud. I want you to just have it in your head, though. Now, the reality is you can probably come up with more than one, right? We can think about times that we've been wronged. It may have been at work. It may have been at home. It may have been with our family, or it may have been with somebody we didn't even know, somebody at the store or somebody at the gas station or whatever it might would be. But someone wronged us and we got angry about it. Those things hurt us, obviously so, right? The fact that you remember it, how many of you are maybe remembering something that happened more than a year ago? Anybody remembering something that maybe happened a decade ago? Some of you may remember things that happened when we were little and we've still not really forgotten about them right there. Well, those things hurt us. And we have to make choices every day about whether to forgive people. Think about how many options or opportunities for forgiveness appear during the course of a day, course of a week, course of a month or a year, a lifetime. And we have choices that allow us to either make that forgiveness or not. And so I want you to think about a time that you forgave someone right now. Now, is number one and number three the same situation for you? Or do you still have number one up here, but my number three doesn't match with number one? Does that make sense? So we have these situations, we have these times where people have wronged us and we've been angry about it. And then we also have these perhaps memories of times that we forgave someone. Why is this so difficult? Say it again. Pride. Yeah, the flesh wants justice for them, not so much for us. Mm-hmm.
And in my case, I just don't think about it.
Sure.
I can never just say I hate it.
Sure.
Nobody ever said it hurt me.
Right.
I never question God.
Right.
But you're quick to the soul.
Sure.
A lot of stuff
Absolutely.
is minor that we do.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a few heinous things in the world that you just cannot get over. But you still, I'll get around it by not thinking.
So it's a good point to make there. We try to be really clear about the fact that there's not degrees of sin, but there's degrees of reaction for us, right? There are things that will bother us more than others. And the reality of that is there are things that would bother me worse than you and vice versa. We all have to have that. And so if we think about number one, a time that someone has wronged us, well, it's hard to really give a definition of what wronged is, because your example of wronged I can't relate to that example. Okay. But if we said, well, this is what wrong means, well, then nobody else could ever experience what wronged is. And so when we think about what was a time that we were wronged, that's a personal thing. It can affect us all in different ways. So then why is it so difficult then sometimes to forgive, even if it's something that maybe seems minor to someone else. Man, I thought that was a question that was going to just generate all kinds of conversation.
Well, I think it's like you said, though, some things might really upset me, and it might not bother me at all.
uh,
Things that might just sit there, or things that might not bother me, I know. What bothers you?
And then I think there's things that you can put out of your mind, and I mean, maybe not forever,
yeah.
but you know, it's like the time Jay said when I was fishing. I don't remember. There's things that was a good thing, but
If you don't know that story, there's a picture in the newspaper of Dad and Sheila's brother. They were, and my grandmother said, she said, and Dad said, I don't think I ever went fishing with Jay in my life. She said, it's on the cover of the Interior Journal right here. So, sometimes we do kind of forget things that are there.
that's a good memory. But there are things but if you sit there and say, I'm going to dwell on this from now
Stew on.
I'm not going to work.
True.
I'm not going to go to school. I'm just going to be mad. Well, then it'll overwhelm.
That's true. That is true.
I saw, of course, Deb's brother, he loved us. I've seen it 1,000 times, he makes 600 but thousands of times. And anyway, one of the little episodes in 1957 night was this woman was in a cabin by herself, two outlaws come along, ended up mad and killed her, but they had been there for 35 days and they'd done a lot of things they shouldn't have done. And when she got ready, she said, I can't stay, just got to get out, I can't live with this. And he told her, he said, that'll be with you, but you have to let it go.
Right.
And it's like Roy said, there's something, and people of all nations, colors, creeds, when that terrible, tragic things happen to them.
Right.
But if you dwell on it, you will never get out of it,
Right.
And it will run you down. You have to overcome. But whatever means is possible. You got to say, I can't go.
Right. So I want us to think. I mentioned a minute ago about family, and I want us to think about that because that's really the basis of our story this evening. I want us to think about sort of forgiving within family and how sometimes that can be easier, but sometimes that can be tougher depending upon perhaps the situation. Think about like a family reunion. How many of you all have a regular family reunion? Anybody have a regular family reunion? I don't know if there's as many anymore as there maybe used to be, but a regular family reunion, and those can be fun. You get to see people that maybe you don't see too often. There are people that maybe live far away that are able to come together. But if you haven't seen them, you may not recognize them. Think about it for a second. It may be a family reunion, or just think about like a class reunion or something like that. And somebody walks in and you have spent so much time with them, but it's so long since you've seen them that you don't necessarily even recognize them. There are people that we have come in contact with quite a bit. And so our lesson today is kind of like this sort of family reunion. I want to go over real quick. And again, I'm presuming knowledge here, but you might remember how Joseph's brothers were jealous of him. Okay. Joseph's brothers were jealous of him. They beat him up. They threw him in a pit. This story may ring a bell with you. They sold him to some merchants who were on their way to Egypt. Joseph's brothers were jealous of him, and they betrayed him in a terrible way. Okay. Now we can tell stories and lessons about all that, but let's just know that he was jealous of him and they got rid of him. They took his coat back to the father. Do you remember what they told the father? That he had been killed. Okay. He'd been killed. And so the father was distraught about this, but he was out of sight, out of mind. And they sent him to Egypt, which I don't know how far it is, but it's 1,000,000 miles away culturally. And so the thought was, we'll never have to see him again. And who cares what happens to him down the way? We won't have to deal with him anymore. Okay. Now, I'm going to use Will as an example here, but I got to have answers from all of you. So, Will, what I want you to do is come up here. You're actually going to go back right beside Jill. All right. So, you don't have to sit by her. You're going to stand right here in the middle. Now, you all are going to dictate what Will does for the next little bit. Okay. Will's either going to take a step forward or he's going to take a step backward. All right. Don't be embarrassed. All right. So a step forward just means to come up to the next row of pews. A step backward is just to right there. Okay. All right. So in this situation, I want us to think about not Joseph's brothers, but I want us to think about Joseph. And when Joseph arrived in Egypt, a lot of things happened to him. Some good, some not so good. And so I'm going to have your help. We're going to think about this role of Joseph right here. Will is Joseph in this case. We should have worn some brightly colored shirt, would have been better here tonight. So I'm going to tell you this, and I want you to tell me, is this a good thing for Joseph or a bad thing for Joseph? If you say good, well, you're going to step forward one. If they say bad, you're going to step backward one, okay? Okay? And so, first thing, Joseph makes it to Egypt. Now remember, he's sold into bondage into Egypt. But Joseph made it to Egypt and was put to work in the house of Potiphar, a captain in Pharaoh's guard. Pharaoh, the king, the leader of Egypt. Joseph was put in charge of all of Potiphar's money. Positive or negative? What do we think? Probably a positive. All right, Will, so take a step forward right here, okay? Potiphar's wife told terrible lies about Joseph and her husband, or to her husband, good or bad. She lied. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that's not the story. And this becomes complicated, right? So he steps forward, he steps backwards. Next one. Because of his wife's lies, Potiphar has Joseph thrown in jail. That's probably bad. Okay, so now we went backwards a little bit. So let's recap here to start with. Joseph was sold. Hold on just a second. Joseph was sold in, he was captured by his brothers, sent him off. And so he's in this situation, but we're going to see here, there's a lot of things happening. Now, with all of these, we're all sort of analytical enough that we can probably think of some good and bad for all of these. But I'm thinking just sort of surface for right now. The head jailer liked Joseph and put him in charge of all the other prisoners, positive or negative. You're still in jail, but it's better to be the best prisoner than the worst prisoner, right? Okay. Joseph uses his God-given gift to interpret and explain other prisoners' dreams, positive or negative. That's probably positive, right? Okay. Joseph was stuck in jail for more than 2 years. That's kind of a negative, okay? So if we're looking at this, we're kind of working our way through the story. Where is Will currently standing right now? That's exactly where he started, right? He's had some good things happen. He's had some bad things. He got 3 more things right here. Pharaoh, ruler of Egypt, heard that Joseph had the ability to understand dreams, positive or negative. Probably positive, unless it goes wrong, it could be bad. But no, come forward. We can't do halves. We're all the way up right there. Okay? Pharaoh releases Joseph from jail to explain his dreams. Positive, right? Now there's a requirement here, but you're out of jail after 2 years. Now we're out of jail, so at least we'd rather be out of jail than in jail, right? Last one. Pharaoh believed what Joseph told him and put him in charge of the entirety of the land of Egypt. Positive or negative? So after some forward and some backwards, where does Will end up? Because that's our last stop right here. He ends up right on the front row. All right. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. So he ends up right here. So for Joseph, it was a positive, but it wasn't all positive. And I want us to think about us. We're never going to be in the situation that Joseph's in right here. But how many of us feel like today we went forward, but tomorrow sometimes feel like we step backwards, right? And part of the reason that we go forward and then we step back are these difficulties that we face in life. Sometimes that back step becomes 2 steps because it's difficult for us to sort of forgive what happened, right? It's difficult for us to maybe forgive what took place. And so we find Joseph, the last thing is in a really high ranking spot. I want us to think about this. Do you think when Joseph's brothers had sort of captured him, do you think he ever anticipated this being his situation? Okay. It's unlikely that when Joseph was captured in those moments of what in the world is happening, he ever anticipated that this would be the case. But that's the same for us sometimes, right? Sometimes our most difficult things, we think, well, I don't know that I can ever come out of this, right? But there's mercy involved that helps. And so we're going to see a little more about that right here. Now, Pharaoh had asked Joseph to interpret a specific dream. Joseph said Pharaoh's dream, and again, this is all in Genesis, but there's too much. We can't read all of it. But Joseph said Pharaoh's dream meant that there would be 7 years where the harvest would be great and plenty of food. But he said there'd be 7 years where there would be nothing. You may remember the story. No harvest, nothing to eat. So it's a feast, famine situation. God's telling Pharaoh here to set aside grain during the good years so that there'd be plenty of food during the bad years, right? So that's exactly what Pharaoh does. And when the bad years come, there was plenty of grain in Egypt, but all the countries around them were starving, okay? And so Egypt's situation's pretty good. Neighbors, not so good. Well, guess what a neighboring country was? Canaan, where Joseph's brothers lived, right? That's an area that was suffering. People came from all these surrounding countries to Egypt to buy grain. And guess who they show up? Guess who's in charge of distributing that? That's Joseph, okay? Because the whole world needed food. Some of these people were Joseph's very own brothers. We're going to see that here in a second. The ones who treated him so badly. You know, sometimes that happens, right? We treat somebody poorly, and then we got to go up and ask them for a favor or something. That's a tough thing, right? But we can all relate. When his brothers show up, Joseph knows who they were, but they didn't recognize him. We talked about that just a second ago. Why do you think they didn't recognize Joseph? Well, I'd say so. He was the youngest one, right? And so he, you think about somebody who's, well, he wasn't the youngest. Benjamin was the youngest one, right? But anyway, he was the one. But think about how much different somebody changes. I think the time frame here is like 22 years. Think about how much. If you don't think it is, look at a picture of yourself from 2000. You looked exactly the same, except totally different, right? All the hair, all the color of it was the same. We weighed exactly the same. We was just as handsome and pretty. But it changes there, right? And so Joseph, they didn't recognize him. Now, that's kind of what we talked about a little bit. Go ahead. Right. Out of sight, out of mind. Right. True. Does it make you wonder how much time the brothers had spent thinking about Joseph and how much time Joseph had spent thinking about the brothers? Wonder who thought about each other more. I'd say Joseph thought about them all the time, because when Joseph was stepping forward and backwards, every step he was making, he wouldn't have taken any of those steps if what hadn't happened. He's in this situation all because of those brothers. And like you said, the brothers, they don't know where he's at. And they might have in their down moments or sad moments thought we shouldn't have done that when their father was crying or whatever, but they probably weren't thinking about it near as much. Now, Joseph's brothers as well are coming to him in a pretty low state, right? Why are they there? They needed food. Sure. So it's a long, we're a long way there. So I want us to go to Genesis chapter 45, and there's a handful of verses here that I want us to read. And the reality is Joseph has already met with these brothers. They've talked to them in chapters 43, actually 42, 43, 44. There's a lot that you can read there, and we just didn't really have time for all of it. But Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 and 2 right here. Mary, do you care to read Genesis 45, 1 and 2? Okay. And so this is Joseph, as high a ranking person as there can be. And he meets with these, let's just call them what they are, kind of stragglers from Canaan who were starving to death, that really, their own stupidity from way back when in a lot of different ways is the whole reason that they're here. They weren't, whatever it might be. But Joseph said, make everyone go out. No one stood with him. And Joseph made known to his brothers, and he wept aloud, and the Egyptians heard it. Now, that last verse there is kind of important. Why do you think Joseph cried the way he did? How would you be glad to see somebody that had treated you so bad, though? There we go. Okay. So this is, if we're going to take this lesson, and again, if we're going to consider this, it's hard to imagine being glad about something that had happened like this. But Lucille, I think you're exactly right. He's clearly glad to see them, right? He's, yes, right? Sometimes the steps forward and backwards lead you to somewhere positive when it's all over. And the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. Why do you think that's tacked on there? Yeah. Why do you think that's? He wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure. Right. Right. We have the food. Yeah. Right.
They couldn't understand it at all.
Right. Go a little further. This is Genesis 45, verses 3 through 8. Kevin, do you care to read this one? You might want to go from your Bible if it's a little small up here.
Then Joseph said to his brother, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers did not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brother, please come near to me. So they came near, and then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve austerity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt.
So a lot of times it's how we view things and our perspective, right? So the actual way that most of us would have felt Joseph should have been ha-haing his brothers as they showed up asking for food, right? That's sort of the nature of it. Remember the cigarette a minute ago, and this is Joseph's chance to sort of press that foot down on them. But Joseph tells them what? Don't be grieving or angry with yourself in verse 8. So now it was not you who sent me here, but what? What's he saying? But God. Well, that's not true. They had literally captured him and sent him there, right? But it's all about this approach and perspective. He says, God has sent me here. What he's saying right here is that we've made the best of this. We're not going to dwell on the things of the past here. But he says, he has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler throughout all of it. He said, this worst thing that could have happened, or what you thought was the worst thing, was the best thing for me. But not only was it good for you or for me, it's going to end up being really good for you as well. Yeah.
Don't you think that without saying it, Joseph is saying the Lord's Prayer here? Nevertheless, not my will.
Right. I think that's fair.
God, this was God's will, and I would accept it whether it's being sold into slavery or being thrown in prison, blah, blah, blah. I want to follow God.
Absolutely. Let me go back just a second right here. Joseph said there at the beginning, the first thing, almost there at the beginning, he asked him what? Is his father still alive? Why do you think he asked that? He loved him. He hadn't forgotten him. That'd been 20 years ago. He hadn't forgotten him. And he hadn't left that behind, but that he wanted to know. And he had asked that. If you go back into Genesis 42 and 3 and 4, he asked similar questions. He talks about Benjamin in there as well. Why do you think Joseph's brothers were afraid? It seems, yeah, when he tells them don't be afraid.
You've got this guy in charge, the head guy, and all of a sudden he starts bawling. You have no idea who he is, what you've done, or what's going to happen now. I mean, you've done found the gold in your bags and everything.
Right.
Like, oh, what's going on?
Right. Right. They do. They have to go home and tell the dad the story there as well. That's a good point as well. But is there still maybe a thought that we're starving and we need food And he might still deny us this. There's still maybe that thought there. Let's go a little further. This is 45, 9 through 11. Jill, do you care to read this? So Joseph absolutely could have used his power to do what? He could have punished them, crushed them right here. And after that, I mean, it would have been justifiable, right? I mean, they've treated him pretty poorly, but he said, come closer, right? He says, I'm the one, I'm the one that you sold. And he says, then go tell my father about this position that I have and tell him everything you've seen here. But he says to do it what? At your leisure? He says to go hurry and do what with him? Go tell him or what? And bring him back right there. And so, go ahead. Uh-huh. I don't know. Probably, probably, I don't, that's not really for tonight, but I understand. And to be fair, nobody's perfect, and sometimes we do things that maybe hurt or upset people, and we don't necessarily even mean to. I don't know why he was. Mm-hmm. Talented or something that just a little further. Genesis 45, 12 and 13. Maria, do you care to read this? So he sends them back. He said, there's 5 more years of famine, right? But you need to go back and tell. Now, I want us to put ourselves into the brothers' spot here for a second. What's the hardest situation the brothers are going to face right here? Tell them to find. Because what do you think the first question is going to be? Right? Exactly. And so that's going to be sometimes for us, sort of showing mercy might put us in a difficult position. It might put us in I don't want to say compromising, that's not the right word, but if I can tell the truth, I can grant mercy or whatever, but then I'm going to be questioned about other things, and I don't want to have to deal with that. Well, the brothers have to deal with this right here. They've got to go and they've got to go back and tell their father, and he says, there's 5 more years of famine still, and we're going to go down into Egypt. Let's finish it right here. Melvina, do you care to read 45 verses 14 and 15? Do you think, this is where we're stopping, do you think these 2 verses are a surprising set of verses from the very beginning of the story, chapters earlier? Certainly so. Certainly so. But I asked you at the beginning about a time that we've been wronged, and then have we forgiven? And I said, does your number 1 and your number 3 correspond, right? And it's difficult for us to maybe do that. Well, I hope you've seen what we've done here. This is the 1 and the 3, right? This is Joseph was wronged in a horrible way, but Joseph reacts. His number 3 there. How does Joseph react? He loves him. Hugs them and kisses them. Do you think at this moment, Joseph completely forgot everything that had ever been done wrong to him? Probably not, because he's human, right? But what was worth more to him? Holding on to that sort of angst that he'd had, or the family that he'd been without for so long being able to come back together? Yeah.
Probably with him too. Joseph was not a full brother to any of them except Benjamin. And of course, the mother, Rachel, she was Jacob's favorite. And I think that's why he loved Joseph more because of the mother.
Right.
Because that was who he loved Rachel.
And then too, Daniel, what I think a lot of times, everybody hears pretty, you know, except some of you know. But, you realize when you get older, some things that upset you when you were younger, you got mad at it, whatever, it was all foolish, it was stupid.
Mhm.
And you got all that stuff get past you. And then another thing, you know, brothers should always love each other, the family, and when it comes to like Jacob, he's gonna love those boys regardless, because that's what a parent does, they love their children. And it all comes back to where love has to be, when we always say faith, love, and charity, that love is the greatest commandment.
Other thoughts on showing mercy? Battery's about dead. I think certainly so. It would almost would have to be. It just it'll need to fix everything. Any other thoughts?
It shows that God has given all our lives to us. We never know. We don't see the big plan like this. And, you know, all of that had to lead up to this to get everybody back united. So I think God's in touch all of our lives, everything.
So what's our lesson? What do we take from this?
I'm pretty good about forgiving people, but when I feel like I need to, but unless they've done it wrong, you will be over it. If I'm not people, then I'll never forgive you.
But that's not the
That's not right, but I'm mad about it. I'm just being honest. I would have a much harder time forgiving somebody for hurting someone else.
right.
And I can, after I forgive it, I can do right by people, that's no problem, but I wouldn't go above and beyond. And that's what we see. He didn't just, he could have done right by everybody, he didn't have to go above and beyond. And then he didn't. He went above and beyond. And that's the lesson for me.
I guess justice is us getting what we deserve. Mercy is us not getting what we deserve. But grace is getting what we don't deserve. And this is a perfect example of that. Mercy would have been, mercy would have been satisfied, okay, well, I'm not going to punish you. But he went above the hour, like talking about what Earth said, and showed them grace to them.
Right.
Give them what they didn't deserve.
Right. Others?
But again, the forgiveness part, that's what everybody has to see at their own heart. But there's some heinous things that can happen in
Sure.
your life. And you have to decide yourself, am I going to forgive this person? Or am I going to dwell on the rest of my life?
Mhm.
If it's guilt tonight, you always have to come to grips.
Certainly.
You know, you're not going to ever forget it or anything, but it could be just a total accident. Somebody just looked down off the road and killed you. You know.
But that was my question at the beginning, was that how we would handle, and I asked you about things that have maybe happened decades ago, and sometimes we have a hard time sort of putting that behind us, and that's why I wanted us to see that. And my last question was, I'm sure Joseph remembered this. Yes, ma'am. So that's a really good question. Does time matter here? If it had been last week or if it had been last year, and or is it, is 20 years different? Or if he was, if he was still, or if he had been, if all the steps Will took a minute ago had been backward, I mean, if that would have been the case. So that's a good question. And so to me, my point on this is that I have no idea how any of this works. And I don't know what the right answer is for any of it. But I think when presented with the opportunity to show mercy, we should. And I don't know that I always would want to do that, but I'm told to do that. And I don't know that my mercy shared is always the way that I would have done it, but that's why we sometimes say that we aren't the judge. And fortunately, we're not the one that judges. It's got to be that he'll judge that. Okay. And so I can forgive and hopefully forget and all of that, but I don't have to. Ultimately, we'll let God sort of sort all of that out. And so if you're struggling with that level of mercy, which we all do at times, if we're struggling with that, you may have heard the saying, let go and let God sometimes, and maybe that's what we sometimes just need to do. And like Boo was saying a minute ago, sometimes we just kind of have to let it go and then almost forget it. Just put it aside, because I can dwell on this forever. And I can, and maybe I need to grant a little mercy to myself. And that's what we might want to do. So I would encourage you, invite you, anything that we can do to help you, whatever it would be. We always extend these invitations. We invite you to come while we stand and sing.
Years